session. Professor J.V. Prasad was to chair this session, but he has been out of India for another academic assignment, so we requested Professor Anisur Rahman ji to chair this session as well, and he accepted. Thanks to him. I request Professor Rahman to please come onto the stage and chair this session. The participants in this session are Abhay KG. I request Abhay KG to please come onto the stage. Abhay KG is an Indian poet, diplomat, editor, translator, and anthologist. He is the author of 10 poetry books, including Monsoon, which is published by Sahitya Akademi, The Magic of Madagascar, The Alphabets of Latin America, and the editor of the Book of Bihari Literature and the Bloomsbury Book of Great Indian Love Poems are among others. His translations of Kalidasa's Meghadoot and Ritusamhar from Sanskrit won KLF Poetry Book of the Year Award 2020-21. His translation of the first Magadhi novel, Phul Bahadur, is now out. He has a copy of it. In 2013, he received SARC Literary Award. Abhayji served as India's ambassador to Madagascar and Comoros, and currently serves as the Deputy Director General of Indian Council for Cultural Relations. His Earth Anthem has been translated into over 150 languages. Next participant in this session is Professor Ranu Unial. I request Ranu Unial to please join us on the stage. Ranuji is Professor and former Head, Department of English, University of Lucknow. She was a Commonwealth Scholar at the University of Hull, the United Kingdom. An author, editor of 10 books, her articles and book reviews have been published widely. She has published 3 poetry collections, Across the Divide, December Poems, and The Day We Went Strawberry Picking in Scarborough. It was translated in Spanish as well. First set of Hindi poems, Sahitya Ke Ghar, was published in 2021. She co-edited essays, Reading Gandhi, Perspectives in the 21st Century, and Mahatma Gandhi, Essays on Life and Literature. Understanding Disability, Interdisciplinary Critical Approaches. She is the Chief Editor of Rhetorica, a literary journal of arts, University of Lucknow. She is a founding member of PISM, if you allow me to pronounce it this way, PISM, PYSSUM, a daycare center for people with special needs in Lucknow. Another participant in this session is Dr. Payal Nagpal. I request Payalji to please come on the stage. Dr. Payalji is Professor in the Department of English, Janki Devi Memorial College, University of Delhi. Her areas of interest are literary theory, modern drama, and Indian English poetry. She combines the India section of the Journal of Commonwealth Literature annually, along with Professor Shamala A. Narayanan. A theatre person and literary critic, she has authored and edited many books. Her publications include a book on John Jennings titled Shifting Paradigms in Culture, and a volume on drama studies co-authored with Anand Prakash titled Text and Performance, a Theoretical View. She has edited and annotated editions of Shakespeare's Othello and Macbeth, as well as Ibsen's Ghosts, Tennessee Williams' The Glass Menagerie, and more recently Mahesh Dattani's Tara. She has contributed entries to the Rutledge Encyclopedia of Indian Writing in English. In the Labyrinth is her debut collection of poems. After this brief and formal introduction, I request the chair to open the session.
Good morning, friends. We are back and we start the second day of the seminar today. We talked lots about how Nissim Ezekiel came on the scene and what he did yesterday. And very interesting points came forward as far as we talked about his significance as a canonizer and also as one who created a condition for the emergence of Indian poetry in English. Therefore, this is the most appropriate time now to think of what are the new directions that Indian poetry in English is taking today. This seminar has been so well planned in the sense that you look at the sessions, how they have been organized, and I must pay my compliments to my friend Malashri, who has thought of this seminar and especially the sessions in the way they go forward. After talking of Ezekiel, we are here to talk of the persons who followed after that and how and what direction Indian poetry is taking. Friends and panelists here, we have 90 minutes, therefore I think that 20 minutes each will make 60 and 30 will be for the audience, interactions, questions, answers, whatever. So going by the name that has been given here, I think his name is first, and I now request you to speak now. 20 minutes?
Good morning to each one of you. Chair of the session, Shri Anishul Rahman, and fellow writers and poets on the dais and in the audience. I see many familiar faces. I am going to, in 20 minutes, I have share with you not only what's being written by contemporary Indian poets, but also what should be written. What should be the new direction in Indian poetry. Most of you must have read Modern Indian Poetry in English by Bruce King, and he paid a rich homage and tribute to Nissim Ezekiel for pioneering modernism in Indian poetry, and also surveys Indian poetry in English for a good part of 20th century, after India's independence up to the end of the 20th century and the beginning of 21st century. And in his introduction, he notes the kind of identifiable periods in contemporary or in Indian English poetry, in which he says that Indian poetry took new directions, such as the focusing on the actuality of personal and family by Kamala Das and Ezekiel in early 60s, or the experimental poetry of Mehrotra, Kolatkar, Nandi, Chitre and Mahapatra, which began to appear in the later 60s and early 70s. A renewed, more detailed, satirical and yet compassionate focus on communal and family heritage became evident to him later. Also, he talks about the other poets. For example, he talks about the poetry of Eunice D'Souza, Salim Piragina, Manohar Shetty, who paid increased attention to details and memories of Indian social reality. Also, in the beginning years of the 21st century, we see a number of poetry anthologies where invariably the focus have been on poets. So we had anthologies titled 60 Indian poets and so on. Also, the number of poets kept on increasing, and I think recently the recent anthology has more than 100 poets. Also, the challenges which the beginning of the 21st century also had a fundamental shift the way we communicate with the introduction of the digital and the process of the faster pace of globalization, we can say. At the same time, we also became more and more aware of the challenges which humanity and our planet faces. And these challenges can be, they are called as triple threats. The triple threats of climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental pollution. With changes in technology and the growing awareness of the immediacy of these threats, something new came up which we know as eco-poetry, a response to the growing threat to our own survival as a species. And poets started responding to it not only in India but also across the world. So these two new changes, the fundamental changes, the transformational changes, have been reflected in Indian poetry in English. And many of the poets who are also present here have included or in some way responded to these challenges. Now, when we look at what was being written in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and we look at what is being written now, there are some common elements which remain there and which would remain there. The common elements, of love and longing, personal life, they are not going to go away. But today challenge in front of us, in front of the literary community, is how to respond to this growing challenge of managing our ecology, managing our ecosystem. The world today, whether we want it or not, is a globalized world. Whatever happens in one part of the planet affects us. It comes to us through internet, it comes through us television channels, it comes through us through literature. So how how the current generation of poets, what should be the new directions? How should we become the voice of a million species who inhabit this planet with us? How do we bring into literature their voice? And what I found of great value and inspiration is from Kalidas, who wrote in 5th century AD. When focusing on eco-poetry, I found that Kalidas, being a contemporary, being one of the greatest eco-poets the world has had. If you read his Ritu Samhara and the way he describes the plight of animals with the heat, the way he describes the interdependence of life. So we can take inspiration from our own classics, but also see what's being written across the planet. How are the poets responding to this challenge? And also this sense of, when we live in a digital world, whatever you publish in India also becomes available simultaneously globally. And what is being published globally is available in India. So it also puts us in this special situation that both the transformations which have taken place are global in nature. Anywhere, poets anywhere, whether they are in Brazil or in Madagascar, they are experiencing it. Today, look at the number of deaths which have taken place because of the monsoon. When I was writing monsoon in Madagascar, my focus was to highlight the biodiversity of the Indian Ocean islands and species which are almost on the verge of extinction, and how to record them before they become completely extinct. But today, look at monsoon. I mean, monsoon here is a poem of love and longing. But monsoon today has also become, a season of sorrow, for so many people. Many of us, but are facing challenges which has been brought by monsoon. But why is it happening? This is climate change. This is extreme environmental response to what we are doing to our one and only home, to our planet. And I think this sense, we talk about nationalism, we talk about, regionalism, we talk about, identities. But this identity, I would like the Indian poetry in English to this new direction to take. This relationship between us, the human beings, and the planet, and our relationship with the fellow species on the planet. I think this is one of the fundamental relationships, fundamental interdependence, which I think should become the focus of Indian poetry. I would also, would like to say that this age is also the third transformation which has taken place, is that we are more aware of what's happening, what's around us in space. And there is also, along with eco-poetry, there is also astro-poetry. What astro-poetry does, or what this awareness does, that is, this makes us love our only home, our only planet even more. Because when we look around us, we find that, it's almost desert. It's cosmic desert all across us. And the only oasis in this cosmic desert is our own planet. So going into space actually, helps us to look at our own planet more beautifully. A day on Earth any day is a million times better than a day on Mars. You would realize it when you look at Mars carefully and how the life on Mars is going to be, if there would be settlement on Mars. So that's I wrote a poem called Celestial, which takes you to all the 88 star constellations visible from Earth through one poem, and it's an illustrated book with illustrations by a 10th century Persian astronomer Al-Rahman al-Sufi. So these three fundamental things, I would like to emphasize on. The first one, just to sum up, the first one is the digital transformation, a global world, a planetary consciousness that, we are a planet. We belong to not only our villages and cities and nations, but we also belong to this planet. This planet is ours. This is our only home in this universe. The second is eco-poetry, which is our, human beings' relationship, our species' relationship with the planet and with the fellow species with whom we share this planet. And the third thing is the astropoetry, or the space, looking more, looking and wondering, looking more at the wonder and the beauty of the universe. It's I have written anthems for all the planets in our solar system, but going even further, it's taking the opportunity which new information, new images from space provides us. So I would love if the poets, the contemporary poets focus on these three things. I'm sure that Indian poetry in English, and not only Indian poetry in English, but Indian poetry in general, could take these steps. As Bruce King says, that modernity in Indian poetry began with Nissim Ezekiel, and it was because there were lots of windows available to the Indian poets writing in English. These windows, and also in fact I was very happy to note that these Indian poets in English, writing in English also were, for example, Ramanujan, for example, many who were writing in Malayalam, in English, but were from Kerala. They introduced modernism in the regional literature, in the sense they brought modernity to the literatures of these places. So I think the new windows of opportunity which call us, which are available to us, to bring new directions, so that it also passes on to Indian poetry being written in multiple languages. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. M.A.K. Then I will just file on.
Good morning. At the outset, I must thank Sahitya Academy for inviting me to this seminar. Thank you, Professor Manashri Lal, and it's a pleasure to have Professor Anisur Rahman as the chair of our session. The title of my paper is "A Life is a Symbolic Pattern. Is this life? Is the interpretation? New directions and new voices." I remember meeting a man with a delicate frame, a buckish nose, with piercing eyes under the glasses, reading his poems at JNU. This was 1986, and we had gathered inside a hostel mess to listen to Nissim Ezekiel, a poet who was a part of our syllabus in BA and MA English at Lucknow University. Widely anthologized, Ezekiel was a name to reckon with. I got my book, signed by him, his Latter-day Psalms, which I show with a lot of pride to my students and research scholars. Ezekiel was soft in tone, but terse in verse. His wild, wicked sense of humor is far too open in his poetry. It hits you like a shrapnel, and you find yourself getting cozy with his delectable irony. A man who is too straightforward with his blunt sarcasm. He says the worst of things with the best of intent to reform and not just to ridicule, to make you realize and let you see how people, customs, traditions, relationships enter a farcical camaraderie that leads to nothing but gross realization that this is a world steeped in a charade of sorts. 2004 was significant for many reasons. But the year saw the passing away of Balamani Amma, Nissim Ezekiel, Arun Koladkar and Long Morris. And this was a major loss to Indian poetry. A quirky, funny poet who changed the poetic landscape with his irreverent, genial humor and ability to be self-critical. A poet who taught the new poets to be serious in a non-serious way. It was his ability to turn the remarkably discreet into a mock satire. Both as a poet and a philosopher, ruminating over life and its dilemmas, Ezekiel has been an engaging voice. He points out not merely our inadequacies, but also our unfailing human stupidity. Whatever he wrote was a transgression of sorts. In her book on Koladkar, Anjali Narlikar draws our attention to the role played by Nissim Ezekiel in promoting young poets. As editor of Poetry India, which was founded in 1966, he was at the forefront of the movement, wherein he provided space to Indian poets writing in English and featured translations from different Indian languages. The influence of Ezekiel on Indian poetry in English is phenomenal. We find it getting more brazen and bolder in its use of imagery, ideas and imagination. Thank you, Mr. Ezekiel, for giving us the gift of language, every man's language, a language that is colloquial without being coarse, a humor that is humane and a bit haughty, a disapproving look without being disparaging. An important aspect of Ezekiel's poetry that has often been overlooked is his preoccupation with loneliness, darkness of the soul, lurking in between lines. The city, in all its contours, beckons him to speak of the dirt and the drain. The amazing fabulist in him, perhaps, had a sense of the uncanny. I quote from Hymns in Darkness. Don't curse the darkness, since you are told not to, but don't be in a hurry to light a candlelight. The darkness has its secrets, which light does not know. It's a kind of perfection, while every light distorts the truth. There is something deeply sad about these lines. He captures the difficulty of knowing, of communicating through words and images, the existential anguish of being. How easy it is to dismiss a man and let him suffer alone the ignominy of desertion, deprivation, and who once wrote, "You are master neither of death nor of life. Belief will not save you, nor unbelief." What a prophetic statement the poet made long before he became a victim of Alzheimer's. All you have is the sense of reality, unfathomable as it yields its secrets slowly, one by one. When we look at the influence and the new directions in Indian English poetry, it is also important for us to look at the early predecessors in the contemporary poetry. It is significant to mark that the trajectory from imitation, where poets in the first phase were derivative. As suggested by Nehru, the Indian Renaissance was twofold. She looked to the West, and at the same time, she looked at herself and her own past. Their dilemma, disquiet, and the inside-outsider status has been aptly analyzed by G.J.V. Prasad in his seminal work, Continuities in Indian English Poetry. In the first phase, we had writers like Derozio, Torudak, Sarojini Naidu, Sri Aurobindo, who asserted their Indianness by writing about the mystical, mythical, and the opulent past. In the post-independence era of the mid-60s and 70s, Kamla Das, Ezekiel, and Jan Mahapatra tore the veil of forced complacency and came out with robust energy. They focused on life, a life lived inside bedrooms amidst poverty and unequal ties. We remember Das for her unbridled hunger, which was seen as a taboo to be shirked and set aside by women. She brings desire. One poet who brings desire into the public domain with an unfailing zest. There is pain of betrayal, there is discontent in love, and there is hunger for more. Mahapatra was more a poet of the soil, refined and yet a poet of discontent. Not satisfied with the unequal social order, he is primarily seen as a poet of despair and disillusionment. He is painfully conscious. Nothing you can say now will repair things, and I do not know what I see. Without being self-effusive, the poet admits the pain of justice, the pain of injustice eats you up. For a coward like me, all I can do is sit down and try to write a sad, sick poem about it. Pathetic, isn't it? But our lives seem to have no choices left. That is why our dreams appear to be betraying life all the time. Patra had the courage to look straight in the eye, and his verse brings out the dichotomies which few poets have dared to explore. From imitation to anger, to a deep voyage unto the self, contemporary Indian English poetry has moved into a terrain of self-exploration. Arundhati Subramanian writes in an idiom of faith, a belief that in the words of Eunice D'Souza, it is best to meet in poems. She writes, I quote, to be leafy, to wilt, to be damaged sometimes by upstart caterpillars and still stay green, periodically, wetly, powerfully green. These are the lines from her poem, I Grew Up in an Age of Poets. Here one sees neither bitterness nor rancor. The woman poet refuses to wilt and die, staying green and leafy, powerfully green. The dreary drone has subsided, and the voice decides to be, to live. Meeting of tongues creates a new metaphor. We as women, we are not interested in opening of camouflage or self-revelation. We are capable of stillness, even as we gallivant, capable of wisdom, even as we rant. We are catabolic women. The new Indian women's poetry that we see has that I don't care look. These are poems of kinship with the world, with nature, with life and living. Here, emptiness is more. With a formidable pen, Mamandai writes about the unease and disquiet that fills the landscape. I quote, when the moon rises, the hill will be empty. Perhaps a long silhouette will lope across the skyline. All the fire remaining in our hearts will melt like ice and dead bone until a brother cries out again, seeking a brother's lost face. Unquote. A deep and abiding interest in the women from the Indian mythology form a distinct corpus in most of the Indian women poets writing in English. A recurring use of metaphors, myths and mysticism does not come as a surprise. Radha, Krishna, Meera, Draupadi, Padmini are figures and have been recreated ever so often. An opening of possible new worlds where we see that none of these myths are value neutral but are extended narratives linking the past with the present. I remember the oft-quoted lines from an introduction by Kamla Das where she said, the language I speak becomes mine, its distortions, its queernesses, all mine, mine alone. Das has never shrugged her choice of language. In the 2022 Yearbook of Indian Poetry, Vinita Agarwal and Sukrita Paul refer to lingering self-consciousness about using English for creative writing, even though we have gone through the process of decolonizing Queen's English. The question of language is linked with the question of survival and that of identity. It is, and here there was a poem by Kandala Singh which was published in the yearbook 2022. The title is All That Angrezi. It is never enough. The accolades, poems published in English, you will create a khichdi, call it English, but still sweat over grammar, struggle with pronunciation. So it feels good as you stand on the podium, this medal for the best poem in English, while your Hindi teacher looks on. This also reminds me of Ezekiel's goodbye party for Miss Pushpa T.S. because the liberties with language do open up space for dialogue, and Ezekiel said, to hell with all directions, old and new. If ever there is talk of rage in the contemporary poetic landscape, Meena Kandasani's name stands apart as a voice of those on the margins. In her voice there is a seething anger, a concern for tomorrow, someone will arrest you. Language is the bearer of one's intimate self. And she writes, I dream of an English full of the words of my language, an English in small letters, an English that shall tire a white man's tongue, an English of tasting with 5 fingers, an English of talking, love with eyes alone. She compels us to look at ordinary Dalit lives. Her resistance comes with a desire to reform the human minds. She critiques not merely the caste hierarchy, but also the government machinery with a severe indictment of crimes against women and Dalits. Hers is a voice that cannot be stifled. It is interesting to note that Hinsa, violence, has become a major subject in women's poetry. Kamla Das, Sujata Bhatt, they all talked of domestic violence. Speaking as a woman and for a woman, I firmly believe that binaries not only disempower us, but they also bind us. They are real as the sun and the moon, the two sides of the same coin, one trying to displace the other. Why is it that the prison of sensibilities created by patriarchy to contain women, argues Mary Jacobus? And why is it that women are on the side of madness as well as silence? In India, binaries get influenced by class, caste, religion, languages, and our sexual preferences. The contemporary Indian women poets in English critique the existing oppressive social structures. In her poem, and the title is fairly long, Ishani Doshi, her poem, Your Body Language is Not Indian, or Where I Am Snubbed by a Bharatanatyam dancer at a cocktail party. She writes, my legs and arms banished, poor things for incorrect mudras and aramandus. And why? Because I refuse to wear the sins of my progenitors in the topography of my chin. Unquote. Here the political and personal struggle is marked with a determination to give up issues unworthy of attention. Dissent keeps the dialogue going. In some ways, Vibhu Bari is also fascinating to read. A poet who shuns people and has traveled less because of his constant battle with bipolar disorder. The tone of his poetry is full of pathos, as in Voyages he writes, it is midnight and the mind and heart go their separate ways. Someone somewhere is always waiting for the heart, holding the past, dreaming of what we lost. Unquote. The poet and his restless spirit are forever battling with contradictions of the mind. It is an endless battle for a man whose fear is widespread, is of many kinds. The dark embers of the soul refuse the clutter and clamor of everyday life, waiting for something to calm the nerves. It was Mary Oliver who once wrote, poetry isn't a profession, it is a way of life, it's an empty basket, you put your life into it and make something out of that. Poetry is born out of restlessness. Unlike the yogi who aspires for stillness, a sense of calm, a poet has insatiable hunger, a disquiet that goads her not towards stillness, but towards writing. Write she must, to survive in this cacophony of madness. Many of our contemporary poets are bilingual. They write in English and they also write in their mother tongue. There are poets like Mani Rao, who's involved in translation from Sanskrit to English, Keshi Lata, Meena Kandasamy, and translate from the Tamil to English. We also have Lakshmi Kannanina, an artist who also translates from Tamil to English. Bilingual poets bring the subtleties of the vernacular with enthusiasm into their English poetry. Most recently, we've had the translation of Hanuman Chalisa by Vikram Seth. Playful and not pedantic, this exercise will certainly pave the way for several other prominent projects in poetry. We have an artist, Abhay Kumar, whose work reflects what Kumaraswamy talked about in the Dance of Shiva. The heart of the Indian experience is to be found in a constant intuition of the unity of life. The inseparable unity of the material and the spiritual worlds is what determines the character of Indian culture. Today, with an upsurge of anthologies, publishing houses, and online publishing opportunities, the world of poets and poems is proliferating. We've never had it so good. It is interesting to see how cyberspace has created computer cross-dressing and in-between gender awareness, cross-expressing, which is now being practiced by Indian poets writing in English with considerable ease. The democratizing and liberating potential of cyberspace is now being questioned as more and more poets are found appropriating AI for easy fame and glory. As the poet's voice rings through the corridors of sanity, we hear the bells from the temple rising in consonance to azan of the masjid and winds chiming in unison with the church bells, and one hears the voice of Nanak, hey, wherein lies the difference? Not in him or her, but in us and them. I wish to conclude my paper with a reading of Ezekiel's first poem in his book, Latter-day Psalms. Counsel for Sri Hariji. Whether you believe or not, think as if you do. Stop the blind effort. Ask yourself what you need. Success of the moment is not in your interest. Turn to silence, nothingness. Where you are is where you have to be. No, you are not wise. This is difficult. Grasp your folly and grasp yourself. What you have eaten is merely unripe fruit. So now, learn to fast. Do without. Be absent. Keep the eyes closed. Keep the mind steady. What you will see, you will also understand. No visions except in darkness. Listen to the voice that is not your own, then move again without remorse or guilt. Love is more concerned about your fate than you have ever been. That is why you have survived. Express your gratitude by giving what you have to give. You may get nothing in return, and bear your restlessness with grace. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor O'Neill. Now may I request Dr. Payal Larpal.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking Sahitya Academy and Professor Marushidar for giving me this opportunity to be a part of the birth centenary celebrations of Nissim Ezekiel. I also want to thank the chair, Professor Nissim. My paper is based on new directions in Indian English poetry in the last decade. It would be apt to kind of talk about language before one speaks about that is Indian English, before one speaks about the new directions in Indian English poetry. The colonial origins of the English language made the journey of Indian English writing a difficult one. The beginnings, as we are well aware, were summed up in the foreword to Rajaram's Kantapura in 1937, and I'd like to begin with an oft-quoted statement. One has to convey, in a language that is not one's own, the spirit that is one's own. One has to convey the various shades and omissions of a certain thought movement that looks maltreated in an alien language. I use the word alien, yet English is not really an alien language to us. It is the language of our intellectual makeup. It is a language of our intellectual makeup like Sanskrit or Persian was before, but not of our emotional makeup. We cannot write like the English. We should not. We cannot write only as Indians. We have grown to look at the large world as part of us. Ram laid out some of the important aspects of Indian English writing. So there is a process of telling involved here in a language he says is not really an alien one. There is a sense of the porosity of borders and cognizance of the process of acculturation in the lines quoted. That is, we have grown to look at the world as a large part of us. There is hope of an expression which will be akin to a dialect and become more vibrant in time. Today, as we discuss new directions in Indian English poetry, we can state with conviction that we have arrived at a juncture where Indian English writing occupies a very important space in the literary world. As we celebrate the birth centenary of Nissim Ezekiel, we acknowledge his contribution in shaping Indian English poetry. He replaced the tendency towards what John Kem called mystical obscurantism and was committed, along with his contemporaries, to inject what he called a new seriousness into writing. K.K.M. Daruwala emphasizes his role in terms of what he calls historical significance in the following words. He pulled an effete Indian poetry by the hair and dragged it into the modern era. So Indian English poetry since then has acculturated and presented a mix of different words, dialects within its scope. The language in poetry emanates from the Indian cultural context, which in itself is a very diverse entity. At the same time, it has displayed a consciousness of the context at the world level in terms of form, theme and style. And in this paper, I will be discussing some of the significant thematic trends along with innovation in form in the past decade in Indian English poetry. Numerous poetry collections have represented characters from the epics, especially the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Where poems based on epic characters have been part of several collections, there have been some dedicated entirely to what we can call conversations with the epics. And here I would like to refer to Kartika Nayar's Until the Lions, Echoes from the Mahabharata, Nikita Gill's The Goddess, the Girl and the Goddess, and very recently brought out Vivek Narayanan's After. And all these fall within this particular category, but they all make use of very different forms in their collection. Kartika Nayar's book retells the Mahabharata from the point of view of the marginal characters. The book cuts across genres as it begins with dramatis personae, making us wonder if it is a play. But many different forms have been used in this book. To quote Marilyn Hacker, there is use of metered prose, Spanish glossa, Malay pantun, Provençal sestina, Pashtun lande, shape poetry, nonce poems. Fluidity of form, use of visual poetry catches attention. Written as a series of dramatic monologues, the book gives agency to the women's perspective, Satyavati, Purna, Sawali to name a few, and also the minor characters, the Padavits, or the foot soldiers. Purna in the poem The Handmaiden's Grave, Purna, who takes Ambika's place with Devdasa at the orders of Satyavati, says, and I quote, "In my tongue, what you sanctioned, schemed, is defined rape, sex under duress. Its rape will haunt the Kuru lineage until Pralaya." The Padavits are the foot soldiers who join with the hope that martyrdom and Kurukshetra will free them not just from the cycle of birth and rebirth, but also past. The father tells the son, and the collection actually begins with the father addressing the son, and the end of the collection is the son who addresses the father. So the father tells the son, and I quote, that this is Kurukshetra. This is where things could change. Son, think. If even the Parayas, Mahar and Shanar, Chamar and Chandal, Bhogi Bhangi, can attain pastless paradise, such an honor, once slain, perhaps our lives too shall stand another chance. The book ends with the son telling the father how hope is belied and there is no skyway to heaven, no winged chariots, and all that remains is endless oceans of flesh. This idea gets an entirely new impetus. I also have, there's a different format in each of the poems that has been used by Kartika Nair. So, in Vivek Narayanan's After, the poetry collections are inspired primarily by the Valmiki Ramayana, but also by different versions, like the Baroda Critical Edition, Sheldon Pollock's 7-volume translation, Desiraju Hanumanta Roy's translation, Arshia Sattar's, N. Raghunathan, and the Gita Press edition as well. The poems, as the poet says, are a reinvention or rewiring, creating a critical conversation with the epic. One moves between characters in the epic and those in the contemporary world. Graphic images, illustrations have been used in this book. For instance, the story of Vali and Sugriv is revisited. There are references to the Amachitra Katha, and the illustrations are again to the Amachitra Katha. There is also a set of poems on certain illuminated pages of Abdul Rahim's Ramayana, which is one of the 3 Akademi Ramayanas, and there are prose pieces as well in this particular collection. So to just give a glimpse of the use of the graphic images here, and what is very interesting is Kumkaran's sound system, and it goes on into many pages. So Nikita gives The Girl and the Goddess is again an engaging poetic tale about the life of Paro, which is interspersed with 9 stories from the epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. It uses the style of the Bildun's Roma, and the book begins at the beginning from her birth, but it stops at a realization of womanhood. Now, there are different sections like the Prastav, Kishoravastha, Naditva, and Upsanhar. The stories of Draupadi, Shikhandi, the goddess Shashti, Parvati, Kali, Sati all inspire Paro. Confronted with her bisexuality about being different, she seeks normalcy, and Shikhandi tells Paro, there are things, and I quote, there are things to wish for, that is not one of them. Quotes close. So the answer, she says, lies in sisterhood. There are several collections that I can talk about here, like Samyukta Das Gupta's Indomitable Draupadi, Shweta Rao Garg's of Goddesses and Women. I move on to another section on rereading fairy tales and legends in poetry. Here, Tanya Mendoza's All the Answers I Shall Ever Get is a rereading of fairy tales. And here, the popular rhyme, 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe, has been reinterpreted as a violent story that ends in what she calls 100,000 waves of blood. Adaptations of legends is another interesting area. Namita Ghosh's first verse collection, which is titled Jungle Nama, is an adaptation of the popular legend of Bonbili, well known in the Sundarban and central to Ghosh's own novel The Hungry Tide. The illustrations are, it's beautiful. It's illustrated by Salman Khan, who's originally from Lahore. And the verse form is the Dipodi Poyar or the two-footed line. And in this legend, of course, where at one level the courage of Bonbili has been foregrounded, very significant concerns about climate have been expressed. Another important theme that has caught the attention of poets today is the city. And few poetry collections, of course, again are dedicated entirely to the city that a poet lived in or they resonated with. One of the oldest inhabited cities, Varanasi or Banaras in popular parlance, comes to life in several collections. We have Ashwini Kumar's Banaras and other poems, where we see history, myth, folklore, everything together, Chaityas, Agauris, parrot astrologers. It also carries lines by Kabir which are interspersed both as transliterations and translations. Vasudhara Roy's Stitching a Poem presents Banaras as a friend, and she writes in through capitals, calendars and unyielding distances, the city keeps faith has remained a friend. More recently, Sharmila Ray's Varanasi within Varanasi is another book. A very, very interesting poetry collection titled Over and Underground in Mumbai and Paris, again by Kartika Nair. This is actually a collaborative work by Kartika Nair and Sampurna Chatterjee, with illustrations by the French illustrator Joël Jolivet and the Bond artist Roshni Ryan. This is really a work of art, and the poem's illustrations present the perspectives of these artists. It's based on the Japanese Renga, where the last line of the first poem is the first line of the next one. And we see the book also opens in different ways. So there is the front cover that opens like this, and then the other half, one is Mumbai and Paris, and the other half opens like this, it's Paris and Mumbai. And just a glimpse of the whole art that is used in the book. Sukrita Paul Kumar's Country Drive, which is co-authored with the Canadian poet Yasmin Lada, presents what they call a Jugalbandi. It ends, there are illustrations by Nandana Kapoor and also Sukrita herself. There is a section where, they call it talking points. And the maze of Delhi roads, they say, are Einstein chock-a-block calculations, but they also become an apt metaphor for the individual lost in modern civilization. There are poems on the Pashmina, the Chinar, an idea that she's carried pretty much into her more recent collection, Vanishing Words. There are other collections like Urban Ali, the Alan Seeley's Zeradina's A Mask, where the title stands for Jalaluddin Akbar, and we move, the narrator takes us from the ramparts of Fatehpur Sikri to Run of Kutch. A very, very interesting area that poets have explored in the past decade is that of ekphrastic poetry. So B.N. Goswami's Devashish Lahiri's Tether That Light is ekphrastic poetry based on 9 paintings from B.N. Goswami's The Spirit of Indian Painting, and each painting is accompanied by a triptych where the first poem expands on the legend, second presents the artist's perspective, and the third connects the painting to the contemporary world. So I won't read out the lines. More recently, Mala Shrilal's Mandalas of Time, which he says it offers the luminosity of healing, but the poems bring together the many facets of Rajasthan alive, from Sheila Devi of Amber, Rani Padmini to Hawa Mahal, Jaipur Bazaar. The book brings to us the epic story of Babuji, the Bhopa singers. Gender concerns are voiced as in the poem Royal Heritage, the lines Padharo Mare Desh, Welcome to My Kingdom is also a clarion call for the missing girls in Rajasthan. Posthumously published is Dikankar Kiwani's Deconing's Smile, which has 9 poems on Bombay, and there are poets who use music to actually understand the city. So, since Ade has already spoken about this poetry, I will skip that section. Cities are also seen in terms of conflict, and there's very beautiful poetry coming from the valley. Ayaz Rasool Nazmi's Songs of Light, and I'll just read out these lines from the poem. The man with the lantern turned the corner, lantern dangling under his cloak. That was the last anyone saw of him in that dark night. Huzaifa Pandit's green is the color of memory, expression becomes resistance, and then there is of course Akhil Katyal's How Many Countries Does the Indus Cross? Gender concerns happen, I think both Abhay and Dr. Anand pointed out how gender concerns have been voiced in several poetry collections, and I think Lakshmi Kannan Sipping the Jasmine Moon, Sanjukta Das Gupta's Indomitable Draupadi, more recently Radha Chakravarti's Subliminal, they stand out. So Kannan's poems engage with strong women, and where she's got this poem called Don't Wash, which is dedicated to Rasha Sundari Devi, the woman who wrote the first autobiography in Bangla, and in it, Kannan imagines the struggles of women like her, and she says, you need no book, Rasha Sundari, no paper or pen either, you have the black, smudgy kitchen wall for your magical scribbles. Radha Chakravarti's Subliminal brings to us the story of Khona from the medieval period, whose tongue was severed. And she writes, the severed tongue cut loose assumes a life of its own, breeds new wisdom. I quickly move on to a very important idea that has been explored recently by more poets. It's been referred to by Dr. Ranu. So these are same-sex relationships, and concerns of the LGBTQI community find expression in several poetry collections. Of course, we have Oshang Merchant's poetry, but new on the horizon we have R. Raj Rao's book, A Proud Declaration of the Identity. The poems reject the diktats of a heteronormative society to go beyond pain and anguish to exercise choice and homoeroticism. In the poem KU lecture, the reference to Kashmir University, 3rd June 2015, he presents his experience of delivering a lecture where he insisted on discussing Aga Shahid Ali in terms of his sexual orientation and how he was quickly whisked away from there. And to quote from the poem, the tea arranged in the begum's cabin remained undrunk. His recent Hydrostrophilia examines contradictions within the gay world. Again, Akhil Katyal's Like Blood on the Bitten Tongue is bilingual, And, again, here spatial topography crisscrosses the architecture of queer love in the book. More recently, Kiran Bhatt brought out a book called Speaking in Tongues, and it's very, very experimental. It's divided into 3 sections, and each of these sections is translated into an entirely new language. So there's autobiography, which is about his experience of growing up as queer, but is translated into Spanish. The second section, Kiran Speaks, translated into Mandarin. The Book of Travels, translated into Turkish. Writers from the Northeast, here I will just mention Gungat Ongmayo from the Simpo tribe, Arunachal Pradesh, whose poetry collection, The Tortoise Prince, is a retelling of 14 folk tales. The Simpos have no written history, and Mao's recording of these oral folk tales in written form will of course help document the culture and belief of the people. So we have many writers from the Northeast, like Shillong-based Esther San. From Nagaland we have Achimbu Kamai, and Persian poet Neetu Das's Crowbite. She represents different places in the Northeast. Arunachal Pradesh has been described vividly in Madhu Raghvendra's being non-essential. Climate concerns, I think that's again another area that has already been discussed, and I will just briefly mention Sudeep Sen's Anthropocene here. And in the book itself, in the foreword to the book by Karen Foch, it's referred to as a 21st century epic, at once collective, personal, historical and immediate. And the interesting part is there are these 9 photographs that are there in the book, and it's titled Atmosphere, and these are photographs of the skyscapes taken during the lockdown, telling us what we are missing. The COVID-19 pandemic has of course been a watershed moment, and poets like Kavish Kher and Vinita Agrawal have responded to it, and more recently K.K. Daruwala. A very, very important area, and start winding up with this, and that is Indian English Dalit poetry. Now this is again very, very important, because a very significant foray into Indian English poetry has been made by Dalit writers. We are well aware of numerous translations of Dalit writings into English, but Dalit poets have ventured to use Indian English to reach out to a wider audience. So in the hands of Chandramohan S., Meena Kandasamy, Gautam Vegra, more recently Emil and Sumit Sanos, Indian English poetry has become more inclusive and more representative in that sense as a genre. Chandramohan S. reminds us of the function of poetry to deal with social issues, and to quote from his poem, "Twin streams of blood voluble flow from the pestering woods of Nangeli with the semi-divine fury of Kannadi." His other book is Love After Bhavan and Other Poems. Meena Kandasamy's Miss Militancy, The Orders Were to Rape You, is followed by her latest collection that Rano has also referred to, so I won't read from that. That's Tomorrow Someone Will Arrest You, where she talks about what it means to be denominational, because she's snubbed by a fellow writer for being denominational. The Absent Color by Emil is extensive in its breadth. The vocabulary of this poetry collection is very different from anything one would have read earlier. So philosophy, geometry, physics, everything kind of comes into it. For example, to read from one of his poems, in Declaration of Independence, "We are chromosomes exposed to some silent stellar collapse inwardly, like the death before death." Any discussion on Indian English poetry would be incomplete without referring to the Japanese forms that many poets have made use of. So they have gone beyond the haiku. So there are collections on the haigus, Senryu, Renga, and now the Gogyoshi. In 2023, we have the first ever collection of Gogyoshi, a Japanese form. It carries a title and 5 lines. Written in English by an Indian poet, that's Rajoshi Patanabis. The book is titled Check This Anomaly. I'll just read out one Gogyoshi. "Broken fragments, erratic rumbles of blurred gold, dreary arrogance of fleeced antonyms. Your blue satire caricatures my colorful white." Gopal Lehri, more recently in Anime Morning and Other Poems, has also used this form. Ranjit Hoskote in Ice Slide has been influenced by the Japanese aesthetic of what is called mono no aware. That is, the poems expressing different moods. The dominant theme, of course, remains of fetching memories and poetry. I'd like to just end by talking about 2 things. One, how there was this collaboration between India and Wales I would want to kind of move towards an understanding of how this kind of internationalization, collaboration that I noticed, especially in the post-COVID period. So, 10 poets from India and Wales had participated and different books were brought out. I will not go into the details, but move on to the anthologies, where of course we have anthologies on different topics like travel, food, reminiscences of grandmothers, anthologies that bring poets together. But two anthologies that stand out. One is Singing in the Dark, a global anthology of poetry under lockdown, which is edited by K. Sachidanandan and Nishi Chavla, and it brings together 112 poets from across the world. There are these significant anthologies on climate change, and I think The World That Belongs to Us, edited by Aditi Angiras and Akhil Katyal, an anthology of queer poetry from South Asia. Interestingly, it carries a poem in English, which the editors found impossible to translate into English. And of course, it redefines the term queer as a signpost that embraces many identities such as asexuals, pansexuals, Mupimambi and Mupimamba, Tirurangai, to name a few. With this, I'll just conclude to say that it would be apt to state now that Indian English poets have marched ahead with confidence to extend the work and breadth of this genre, both in terms of form and content. Poets have responded with great sensitivity and reaffirmed the role of poetry as being a testament to the individual and, more importantly, to the times.
You can look at the watch and I see that there's not enough time for us to interact. Yet, if you have a question or a comment to make, very briefly, because I do want to speak the word after this. I can't. Yes, please, Venika.
Hello. So first of all, my compliments on such an exhaustive and extremely informative and a pan arc of in modern Indian poetry and contemporary Indian poetry in English. But I missed the section on spiritual and Sufi poetry, which a lot of Indians are writing on. For example, Gayatri Majumdar's book, Anju Makhita's Sufi poems and translations of Buddhism. Although that's not contemporary English poetry, I suppose it is a translation. The names don't come to my mind immediately, but there's a lot of spiritual poetry that we've been reading. And something like Vivekananda's translation of, not translation, but reference to Valmiki's Ramayana is not really spiritual poetry because he has taken it to another tangent. But the inward-looking divine soul reaching out to the Supreme Being is a section of Indian poetry which is very much there. And I was looking forward to somebody mentioning that as well. Any thoughts and any comments on that?
Is it directed to anyone in particular? Okay. Would you like to respond? Is there another question also? Can they come together? Yes, please.
So, first and foremost, thank you so much. That was really a vast canvas that all three of you have covered. I thought I was quite audible without the mic. I just had a question not directly related to the poets that you all have spoken about or to the themes that you have put forward so fabulously, but I was curious to learn about publishing houses and whether we see some change in the kind of publishing houses that are publishing, in particular, Indian English poetry. So I was wondering if you had any ideas about that, or if you could inform us about that.
So actually
actually, you're right that my
To first answer Vinita's question on, of course, yes, you're absolutely right. Also, Auditorium Subramaniam, of course, has done a lot of work there. And Suresh Sethi, I think almost every year brings out a poetry collection. But I was also kind of looking at some of the themes that, were probably there earlier, but were also kind of being redone at the level of form. So, epic characters is something that they've always been there. But I think the way in which Bhakti poetry or kind of Sufi understanding of poetry, it kind of seeps in also in terms of existing poetry collections where they appear, as translations and so on. I mean, we of course have Rahim and other poems, which is the latest one, and by Nissim Ezekiel. So it is there, but I'm not looking at it as a trend that has redefined itself in a certain way, which is why I kind of did not bring it up. I thought it was positive time. And to answer the question on publishing houses, yes, the publishing houses have also kind of reinvented themselves in a big way. So, if I look at some of the important publishing houses that bring out poetry, apart from the established ones like Penguin Random House and HarperCollins, but to look at, publishers like Autos Press, for instance, and Havaka, they've kind of they have very different ways in which they produce the poetry collection. So I think one particular publishing house that presents poetry almost like artwork is Red River. So you pick up any poetry collection by Red River, it's just done in such a fantastic manner. It's the way in which there are illustrations or artwork on practically every page at times in that book. It's such a delight to read them, and they don't take away from really speaking what you're reading. So publishing houses, I think, are also kind of, that's my understanding, looking at poetry in a different way.
I'll just add to this on the publishing scene. I mean, there are many more publishers of Indian poetry in English these days than there used to be. So you also have Poetry Wala, you have Copper Coin. I mean, most of these are poets who are publishing, but they are also publishers. They are poet publishers, and actually there are many more. Then you have poetry, chair poetry, from Kolkata, I saw. So the number, the opportunities. Also, you have Bloomsbury. You have got, Mapping publishing poetry. So I would say that there are more than 24 poetry publishers, active poetry publishers, and there's a huge opportunity now for publishing poetry.
Thank you. Before Mr. Kumbhane says stop and proceed any further, just a few words. I understand that this session calls for another seminar altogether. There are so many ideas thrown up, and I'm saying thrown up, so that you cannot really comprehend everything that has been said and can't take care of everything that has been said. It's just like kisse littu, kisko chumu, kisko baho mein lahu. There are so many ideas that you have shared. My whole understanding of the great variety that you have talked about, this distinguished panel that has talked about thematic variety, mostly thematic variety we have talked about. We have talked about the conditions around lots of things I'm not going to do. My basic concern is not all this, but my basic concern is the poem itself. My basic concern is, does it emerge as a poem? What I want to say just very briefly, I will tell you, because there is no time for that to explain further on that. There is a word. This mic is a word. Now the poet can use this word, transfer this word into an image. And a poet who is not that very strong, his image, if it can't really concretize that image, it will fail, and the poem will fail. But it is a stronger poet with greater imaginative vitality, he will change that image into a simile. If he becomes breathless after 2, 3, 4 lines, his poem fails. But if you have a greater poet than that, then you change it into a metaphor. And the test of the poet is if you are in a position to create a metaphor. The question we need to ask ourselves, because if I look at this audience, very nice audience, very distinguished, very able persons are here. And if I ask, do you write poetry? Most of you will raise your hands, yes, I write poetry. Most of us are writing poetry. There is a surfeit of passion as far as writing of poetry is concerned. There are publishers, of course, but these publishers are not available to all the poets. That is another very ugly reality. So my question is that I am not concerned so much with the thematics, I am concerned with the architectonics of the poem. So are we in a position to create that strong metaphor in a poem, or are we really writing a statemental poetry, making one statement after another with certain commas and full stop? It's very hard to say, and I won't like to say that it must be said because it's a very intimate group and most of us are either writers ourselves or critics. We have a surfeit of poetry these days. Everybody is writing almost. And in such a situation, how do we sift, how do we understand, and how do we differentiate, and how do we discriminate? So I said jokingly, but this is not a joke, this is a serious matter, that you write a paragraph in prose. You break the lines into small and short ones, put certain commas and full stops here and there, and it takes the shape of a poem. Ask yourself if it is the situation today. Most of us don't understand the very architectonics of the poem. The poem itself, my question is the poem itself. So the surfeit of poets does not really bother me. In all generations there have been poets, and too many of them. P. Lal from Writers' Workshop in Calcutta, when he brought out his very important anthology, it was also criticized. Indian poetry in English, an anthology and a credo. The word credo is very important in that title. And there he says lots and lots and lots of writers, poets are there today, 500 plus poets are writing. It was in the 60s, it is today very true after 60, 50 years or so, plus so many people are writing. The question is not of the number or of the themes or of the publishers, because where else in the world will you get this variety if not in India? We are a multilingual country and a multicultural, it's soft said. But we have that kind of an identity through which we can produce the kind of poetry if we have that command on the form. So I was talking of the form of the word that takes the shape of a metaphor. Some poets, only a few are those who can transform this metaphor into a symbol. And far, far distant are those poets who can transform those symbols into myths. I am looking for those poets who are trying to write that myth. Myths of light is a phrase that Ezekiel uses in one of his poems. So a poet creates a myth of the light. You can't explain this myth. What does he mean by this myth of the light? So the situation is very encouraging as well as it asks us, wants us to further develop, deliberate upon this. That's why I said, Mala, that we need a seminar altogether on recent trends or the new developments in Indian English poetry. Role of anthologies is very important. There was a seminar planned in Chandigarh on the role of anthologies only, because anthologies have done a great job, and there are very good anthologies and very indifferent and very anthologies which are just putting together. There is a philosophy behind an anthology. There is a philosophy behind a publisher, and there is a philosophy of how we write and why we write. So there are lots and lots of things. I understand that a seminar is a place where we test our ideas. There's no sense of finality anywhere. It's only a testing of ideas. I'm also testing my idea with you. So I have my notes here, full notes here. We cannot talk about it here, but there will be occasions to talk about. My only idea is, and that is what I want to say, that we need to think further about a poem itself. The poem unto itself, what am I? Do I really stand? Do I really communicate? Do I have the strength and the power to communicate? And that is what we as poets and as critics need to engage in. Thank you very much. If we have taken time enough, please excuse me.
Thank you, Professor Rana, for so finely concluding this session. And thanks also to all the three participants, Abhayji, Ramuji and Bhavanji, for covering so vast a canvas of Indian poetry in English. The session ends here. We will have a tea break, and get back at 12 o'clock for the next yet another interesting session, reading and teaching Nissim Ezekiel. Rama Unyalji will chair that session. And Professor Manpreet Kaanji, Professor Vachana Sethiji and Dr. Kalyani Rajanji will share their views that session.